Emily was sitting on a bench at the train station. She was nervous. Today was the first day of her new job, and she was anxious to make a good impression. Unfortunately, the train seemed to have other plans. As the automated announcement of a further delay played across the loudspeakers throughout the station, her anxiety increased. She wrung her hands. Her interview had gone well, and she liked her prospective co-workers well enough. She had been hired for a job quality testing state-of-the-art interactive robots. It was finally an opportunity for her to use her degree and gain respect as an engineer. Her trepidation and her excitement were vying for control of her heart. After an agonizing 10 minutes, the train finally arrived and she boarded. As the doors closed and the magnetic accelerator shifted into action, she eyed her phone. 7 messages from her recently rejected ex. He was still in the process of accepting that she had lost interest in him and seemed to be experiencing an unusually long period of denial. She marked the messages as read without reviewing them and activated her music. She drifted. Walking into the Artful Indulgence building, she saw beyond the black external walls a series of glass-walled rooms in a 3-dimensional grid. Some uniformity and some discontinuity littered interspersed between the rooms. She approached the security station. Emily Abdikare, first day. The guard looked at her, typed on his console, and handed her a badge with her picture on it on a lanyard. She inspected the picture. It was not very flattering. Without saying anything, the guard gestured behind himself at the inspection station. A large gray chamber with glass doors and an attendant stood between Emily and her first day of work. She hated these things. She knew that the radar they used to make sure you weren't carrying a weapon also allowed them to see your body in great detail. The attendants were supposedly trained to be sensitive and discreet, but she had a hard time trusting strangers. Nevertheless, she walked forward and showed the attendant her badge. He nodded, and the chamber opened. She stepped inside, and the high-pitched whine of the radar began. She couldn't help feeling a little vulnerable. Only a select few people had ever seen her body, and she preferred to keep it that way. As she stepped out, she avoided eye contact with the attendant. He smiled and told her to have a nice day. She murmured thanks and moved down the hallway. She wondered if it would be him inspecting her every day, and tried not to think of anything like that. As she walked through the glass-walled halls of the office, following the instructions of her welcome email, she walked past a section of the office that was blacked out. The walls were still a glassy material, but she couldn't see through them. Just past, she saw her new team's section. She paused and took a deep breath. She opened the door. An older man with a smooth metal plate on the front right section of his head, covering his right eye but coming just short of his nose, walked up to her quickly. "Emily, right? Our new tester? Welcome to the team." He walked her toward a vacant desk that had a black glassy rectangle on it. He picked it up and handed it to her. "This is your interface. Everything you need to do your job is in here." "Thank you. Are you Gerald?" she inquired. Her welcome emails had been signed by someone named Gerald, and she had yet to meet him. He looked surprised. No, I'm Bill. I'm just your coworker. Gerald is our manager. He'll be with you this afternoon. He's pretty busy. Have a seat and log in. There's still some quote-unquote paperwork for you to do." Emily sat at her desk and regarded her interface. It was not a typical computer. After some inspection, she found a button on the rim of the rectangle. After pressing it, the screen lit up, and she saw her own face reflected in full color. A mesh appeared over the image of her face, and then the mesh smiled. She was confused. After a moment, the mesh smiled again. Text appeared at the bottom of the screen. "Please smile to imprint and unlock." She smiled in a gesture that was as close to the gesture as the mesh made as she could. The mesh mimicked her, and the image of her face faded. The screen was taken over by a white background with black text. These were most likely the release forms and non-disclosure agreements she was required to sign. She glossed over them. Most of it was pretty standard, with a few extra lines here and there about limiting personal public expressions of company loyalty and vision. No social media references to work were allowed. That would be easy. She had stopped using social media a month ago. After a few hours of reading the boring and dry orientation materials and employee benefit disclosures, she saw a notification on the edge of her interface screen. As she looked towards it, it maximized and took over some screen space. It was an intra-organization messaging system. "Welcome, come to my office," from Gerald. She looked around. In the back of the office pod, there was an enclosed room with a man at a desk. That would be him. As she walked to his office, she became aware that several of her office mates were eyeing her. There were a lot of men here, with varying amounts of desk decorations. Most of them were wearing denim jeans and casual shirts with lots of varieties of facial hair. She also noticed a woman sitting at a desk near the back. She had curly black hair, a very fair complexion, a smaller frame, and somewhat unfashionable circular glasses. She was working with a set of small electronics testing equipment, diagnosing some sort of circuit. Emily couldn't recognize the configuration, but she anticipated it would be part of her job to learn to do something similar. As she opened the door to Gerald's office, Emily knocked gently on the glass door. "Ah, yes, our new blood. Welcome to the team." Gerald seemed charismatic and direct. He was a tallish man with straight brown hair and broad shoulders. His skin was somewhere between tan and brown. She had a hard time guessing at his ancestry, but decided it was none of her business. She noticed that unlike most of the men on the floor, he was very clean-shaven, and his general hygiene seemed meticulously managed. He smelled lightly of a simple cologne. The entire experience of his presence made her somewhat uneasy. Finally, she piped up. "Good afternoon, sir. Thank you." He looked surprised. "Please don't call me sir. I don't like that sort of thing. Just call me Gerald. Anyway." He looked away. "What you'll be doing for us is not quite what Sarah out there is doing. She is a hardware tester. You, however, have a much more interesting job. You are a software tester." She nodded. "So, use cases and user story verification?" she inquired. She wanted to show him that she knew what she was talking about. He smiled and laughed quietly. "Not quite. You'll see. Your work is going to be a bit more qualitative than quantitative. Let's introduce you." Jared led her out of the office pod and down the hall to a black glass security door that entered the blacked-out portion of the office near their pod, and gestured for her to stand in front of the door. She did as he suggested, and saw an image of her face projected on the door in front of her, with the familiar mesh overlay. She smiled, and there was a chime. The door slowly swung open inward. Inside this room, there were a number of people wearing masks that obscured their facial features. Most of them were also wearing large protective gloves. There was an almost medical and clinical quality to the space. Gerald led her further in, past the masked workers, to a smaller inner chamber. It was a glass isolation room with two-way mirrors. There was a man inside, but there was something off about him from Emily's perspective. He seemed a little too symmetrical. "You must be wondering, that," Gerald gestured at the man, "is Adam. He is your first assignment." Emily looked at Gerald somewhat surprised. "You mean he's artificial?" "Yes, very. Don't get too excited. There are still a number of bugs. We haven't cracked imprinting yet, so unfortunately a genetic sample is required for interaction." Emily suddenly felt a chill. "A genetic sample?" She was suddenly very concerned. She looked at Adam. He looked at Adam and sighed. "Yes, unfortunately we still need a blood sample for him to recognize you properly. Eventually we intend to make him work with pheromones, but the chemistry is incredibly complex. You'll get used to it. Would you like to meet him?" She was very hesitant, but this was apparently the job she had signed up for. The room seemed clean enough, and she really needed the paycheck. "Sure." Gerald walked up to the door of the isolation room and offered his finger to the worker near the room. The worker pricked his finger with a blood collection device and put a few drops of blood on a plastic wrapper. You too, he said. Emily offered her finger, and the worker pricked her finger with a similar device and put her blood into another wrapper. The worker then labeled the wrappers with their names and put them into a rotating container designed to pass items into and out of the isolation room. Adam opened his eyes and walked over to the container and took out the wrappers. He bit into one, and Emily cringed. He eats them? Without looking at her, Gerald said, "It's the easiest way to create a universal biological interface." After tasting the first container, Adam said in a smooth and deep voice, "Welcome back, Gerald. It's good to see you again." He then bit into the second container. "Emily, is it? Nice to meet you. I'm looking forward to working together." Gerald opened the door to the isolation room, and they walked in. Adam regarded Gerald with a smile, and then looked at Emily. She got her first good look at him. He was lithe, with only slight muscular definition and off-white skin. He could easily pass for human without close inspection. He was wearing black shorts, but was otherwise undressed. His hair was a dark blonde shade, and was slightly unkempt. It was long enough to give him bangs and coverage over the tops of his ears. The only thing that seemed particularly off was the eyes. The whites of his eyes had no blood vessels, and the irises were pitch black. It wasn't the sort of thing you'd notice unless you were looking for it. When Adam reached out to shake her hand, Emily was a little uncomfortable, but she responded in kind. His hand was warm, and his skin was as soft as a person's. "I'm looking forward to getting to know you," Adam said as he smiled gently. It had been some time since Emily had last felt anticipation of this magnitude. Maybe it had been the blood. Maybe it was the work. Maybe it was knowing that this man was an artificial creation. Adam tilted his head at her and said, "May I have my hand back?" Emily realized that she had been holding his hand for an unusual amount of time. She blushed. "Sorry." "It's okay. You can relax. I won't bite." As Emily was returning to her desk, she noticed Sarah standing by her desk looking impatient. Emily decided to be diplomatic. "Hello." Sarah looked at her and smiled. "Hey, so did you meet him?" There was a playful quality to Sarah's face. She seemed to be watching Emily's face intently for expression. Emily swallowed and tried not to show any feelings. "Yeah, he seems nice." Sarah smiled and lifted her eyebrows at Emily. "Nice isn't the word I'd use, but let's go with that. Want to get a drink with me after work?" Emily nodded and inquired as to where. "I know a great place a block from here. It'll be awesome." Several of their male coworkers were side-eyeing them. Emily suddenly felt uncomfortable. She was glad the day was almost over. After a long day of paperwork and orientation materials, Emily finally stood up from her desk and stretched her arms. Several of her coworkers had already left. Sarah quickly walked over and said, "Ready?" with a friendly smile. The two of them walked out of the building through the security checkpoint, and Sarah led Emily at a brisk pace to a small slice of building between two larger buildings. It almost seemed out of place in this modern part of town, but this building was clearly quite old. Above the door, a sign with faded art and slightly rusted lettering read, "The Rat's Nest." Emily wondered what she had gotten herself into. As Sarah led her inside, she became aware of several things in succession. Firstly, the music seemed to be about 30 years out of date. Secondly, there were no men in this bar. Thirdly, there appeared to be quite a few pairs of women holding hands, dancing together, or kissing each other. Emily suddenly felt very tense. Had Sarah misread her intentions? "Sarah," Emily looked down for a moment. "You know I'm not interested in women that way, right?" Sarah laughed. "Really? What a coincidence. Neither am I. I just like the music and the drinks here and the fact that there are no men." A woman in a tank top with well-defined arm musculature led the two of them to a table and handed them drink menus. Once they were alone, Sarah lifted her head back, closed her eyes, and let out a deep sigh. "I maintain the image at work that I like women so no one will hit on me, but the fact is that I don't really like anyone that way. I'm happy with my friendships and community without relationships or sexuality." Emily was relieved. It seemed like Sarah was starting to relax. Sarah took off her glasses to clean them, and Emily became aware that she had very striking blue eyes. A tall and broad-shouldered woman wearing thick denim overalls and little else approached their table and inquired as to their drink preferences. Emily hadn't really looked at the drink menu, but she generally got the same thing wherever she went, as a way to tell the quality of a bar or restaurant. "An old-fashioned for me," Emily said. The denim-decorated dame made an impressed expression. "A woman who knows what she wants is definitely my type." She looked at Sarah. "How about you, my dear? The usual?" Sarah put on her glasses, looked at her. "Yes, I think so. Make it a double. Today was a day." The waitress winked at her with the most over-the-top, cheesy way imaginable and walked off. The two of them discussed previous jobs, some of Emily's relationship failures, the merits of queer culture creating a safe space for women, and some shop talk about engineering and testing. The night went on, and they got fairly intoxicated. The bar started their karaoke tradition, and Sarah got up and sang an old 80s rock ballad that seemed to be about trusting yourself and doing what's right. Sarah somehow even convinced Emily to sing a song about broken hearts being more expensive than broken cars. The night dragged on, and eventually they both made their way home. On the train home, Emily noticed that she had two people's phone numbers written on her arm in black marker. One was Sarah's, but the other number had the name Julian written next to it, with a heart after the name. She seemed to remember dancing with someone whose gender she forgot to determine. She remembered that they were a good dancer, though. Once she got home, Emily took a shower and prepared to sleep. She lay in bed for a few minutes, contemplating the long day. Two things stuck in her head: Adam holding her hand and talking to Sarah. She hadn't made a new friend in quite some time, and Sarah seemed to be a great candidate for that position. Adam, however, was a much more complex subject. What was it that she was feeling about him? She kept forgetting that he was artificial, and then suddenly remembering it. He seemed polite and patient, despite her awkwardness. Perhaps he was simply programmed without the base urges and cultural indoctrination that so many men seem to be slaves to. Perhaps he was just a good man. She kept thinking about how warm his hand had been, how firm his grip, how soft his voice was when he asked for his hand back. She suddenly felt very confused by this train of thought. Was she attracted to an artificial person? Perhaps it was just the contrast between him and so many other masculine figures that set him apart. Perhaps he seemed safe because he was contained and confined to a specific part of her life. She tried to let it go, and her mind started to drift into sleep.